something's not adding up with the Indiana Fever. These aren't just ordinary losses, and Caitlin Clark's absence isn't just an unfortunate injury. When you put the pieces together, the timing looks a little too convenient, almost like it was designed to give someone else more control behind the scenes. Think about it. The Fever have blown huge leads, crumbled in crunch time, and made baffling decisions in back-to-back games they should have easily won. On paper, this is a team with enough talent to compete, yet suddenly they look unrecognizable. And at the center of it all, their superstar mysteriously sidelined for 12 straight games with an injury that nobody seems willing to fully explain. Now, I'm not here to throw wild accusations, but when the official story is vague, when press conferences recycle the same canned phrases, and when reliable players are frozen out in key moments, that's when you start connecting dots. And those dots paint a picture that's far darker and far more intentional than anyone is admitting. Because here's the real question. Is Caitlin Clark's absence just a medical situation, or is it a convenient cover for something much bigger? The meltdown didn't happen quietly. First, the Fever stumbled against the Dallas Wings, a team buried near the bottom of the standings. It wasn't just a loss, it was a collapse. They came out strong, built momentum, and still somehow unraveled when it mattered most. That should have been the wake-up call. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because then came Washington. And if the Dallas game raised eyebrows, the Mystics matchup lit the alarms. Indiana held control, up 19 points, with the crowd buzzing like the game was already in the bag. But then the fourth quarter happened. Washington stormed out with an 18-7 run, slicing the lead apart, flipping the game on its head, and leaving the Fever stunned. In less than 10 minutes, they had gone from commanding dominance to outright disaster. Losing one game like that, you can chalk it up to a bad night, but losing 2 straight in the exact same fashion against opponents they had no business losing to exposes something far bigger. This wasn't just sloppy basketball, it was systematic breakdown. The offense froze, the rotations got confusing, reliable players were benched in crucial stretches, and when the pressure mounted, there was no clear leader to steady the ship. And that's the key detail, because in moments where everything falls apart, the absence of a star like Caitlin Clark becomes impossible to ignore. Without her, the Fever aren't just losing games, they're losing their identity. But if this was just about missing a superstar, the story would end there. Instead, every loss, every collapse feels like it's part of a timeline that's being carefully shaped. And once you look closer at that timeline, things start to look a whole lot more suspicious. 12 games. That's how long the Indiana Fever have been without Caitlin Clark, their franchise cornerstone, their offensive engine, and the player everyone in the league prepares for. Officially, the reason is a groin injury. But here's the problem. Nothing about the way this injury has been communicated feels straightforward. Groin strains in basketball are unpredictable. Sometimes a player misses a week, sometimes a few. But 12 consecutive games? That's far beyond precaution. And what makes it even stranger is the silence surrounding it. No clear medical updates, no projected timeline, just the same recycled talking points about managing her recovery and taking things slow. It's the kind of language that gives the illusion of transparency while revealing absolutely nothing. And that silence matters, because when your most important player disappears for nearly a third of the season, fans deserve answers. Instead, all they're getting is ambiguity. And ambiguity doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone benefits from keeping the situation unclear. Think about what Clark represents. She isn't just the Fever's best scorer, she's their gravitational pull. She dictates defensive schemes. She influences locker room energy. She shapes how coaches draw up plays in crunch time. Take her out of the equation, and the entire balance of power inside the team shifts. Suddenly, the coaching staff has the freedom to experiment without worrying about their star player questioning those choices. Now, nobody's saying Clark is faking anything. That would be absurd. But here's the uncomfortable question. Is her extended absence being stretched out because it conveniently gives the Fever's leadership more room to push their system? When you line up the timing, the pieces fit too perfectly to ignore. Because without Clark on the floor, the Fever don't just lose a superstar, they lose the one voice powerful enough to challenge the decisions being made behind the scenes. While Caitlin Clark's absence dominates headlines, another storyline has been quietly simmering beneath the surface, and it's just as revealing. Enter Sophie Cunningham. On paper, her numbers don't scream superstar. 8.9 points per game, shooting nearly 48% from the field. But here's the thing, numbers don't always tell the full story. What Sophie brings isn't flash, it's reliability. She's the type of player you can count on to make the smart play, to hit the open shot, to steady the offense when things get shaky. And in games where Indiana's leads are slipping away, reliability is exactly what you need. Yet somehow, Sophie has been consistently frozen out of crucial possessions. Fourth quarters roll around, the Fever offense sputters, and instead of leaning on their most efficient option, the ball gets funneled elsewhere. It's not just once or twice, it's a repeated pattern. That's the detail that stands out. Because when something happens over and over again, it stops being coincidence. It starts looking systematic. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Sophie's rise as a clutch performer has been gradual, game by game, possession by possession. She's earned those late-game opportunities. She's proven she can handle the pressure. But the more she proves herself, the less she seems to be trusted in the moments that matter most. That contradiction doesn't make sense unless you look at it through the lens of control. With Clark sidelined, Sophie could have stepped into that stabilizing role, the steady hand in crunch time. But if your coaching staff is focused on pushing a system, their system, then having a player who quietly proves them wrong becomes inconvenient. And what do you do with inconvenient players? You minimize their role, even if it means sacrificing wins in the short term. So when you line it up, the picture gets clearer. Clark's absence removes the star who could question coaching decisions. Sophie's exclusion sidelines the role player who could expose flaws in the system. Together, these moves create space for the Fever to run things exactly the way the staff wants. Results be damned. And if that feels too neat, too deliberate, just wait until you see how the media narrative ties into this puzzle. Here's where the dots start connecting. When you step back and look at the timeline, Caitlin Clark's injury and Sophie Cunningham's crunch time exclusion don't look like isolated events, they look like pieces of the same puzzle. Think about it. Clark goes down with a groin injury and suddenly disappears from the lineup for 12 straight games. No concrete timeline, no clear updates, just vague reassurances about taking it slow. At the exact same time, Sophie, one of the team's most reliable clutch options, gets iced out of critical possessions even when the Fever offense is visibly falling apart. That overlap isn't random. It creates the perfect environment for one thing: coaching control. Without Clark in the locker room, the gravitational center of the team is gone. The voice powerful enough to question late-game decisions isn't there. The superstar who could look a coach in the eye and say, "This isn't working," has been removed from daily operations. That's not just a medical absence, that's an opportunity. Now, drop Sophie's situation into that same timeline. She's been proving herself as a dependable closer, the kind of player who makes it harder to justify experimental rotations. But instead of rewarding that consistency, the coaching staff systematically goes away from her. Why? Because her success could undermine the narrative that the system comes first. And this is the crux of it. What we're watching isn't adaptation, it's implementation.
The Fever aren't adjusting to their circumstances, they're using those circumstances as cover to force through a coaching philosophy that hasn't been working. It's why the offense looks robotic. It's why the same mistakes happen no matter the situation. And it's why Indiana keeps dropping games they should be winning. Because winning isn't the priority right now. Establishing control is. And when you realize how perfectly the timing aligns, it stops looking like bad luck. It starts looking like strategy. But this pattern doesn't just show up on the court. It shows up in the way the media has been handling the story too, and that's where the silence becomes deafening. If you really want to understand how deep this story goes, don't just watch the games. Watch the narratives around them, because the way the media has handled the Fever during this stretch might be the most suspicious part of all. Not long ago, Carolyn Peck was everywhere on television pushing a bold take that the Indiana Fever were actually better without Caitlin Clark. That's a headline that grabs attention, stirs debate, and conveniently supports the idea that the team could thrive while their superstar sat out. For a brief moment, it almost seemed believable. The Fever did scrape together a couple of wins early in Clark's absence, but then reality hit. The losses piled up. The better without Clark theory collapsed in real time. And just as quickly as the narrative fell apart, so did the media appearances. Carolyn Peck, once the loudest voice on the subject, went radio silent. No follow-ups, no defense of her take, nothing.
Now, you can chalk that up to coincidence, or you can see it for what it is: damage control. When a narrative designed to support the coaching philosophy implodes, the easiest way to handle it is to stop talking about it altogether. And that sudden silence, it speaks louder than any on-air analysis ever could. And it isn't just Peck. Look across mainstream coverage and you'll notice a trend. Reporters keep focusing on vague injury updates, surface-level stats, and safe storylines. What they don't touch are the patterns. The consistent crunch time collapses, the exclusion of proven performers, the lack of accountability from the coaching staff. Those threads get ignored because pulling them would unravel something much bigger. This isn't incompetence, it's intentional framing. Narratives that don't fit the system get downplayed, while convenient ones get amplified. And when they collapse under scrutiny, the solution is silence. The question is, why? Why protect a narrative that's clearly failing on the court? The answer lies not just in the media, but in the locker room itself, because that's where the real fractures are starting to show. If you really want to know what's happening inside a team, don't just listen to what players say, listen to how they say it. Because when you start reading between the lines, the Fever's locker room is sending signals that something isn't right. Take Sophie Cunningham, for example. On the surface, her recent comments sound diplomatic. We've got new players and we just have to adjust. We need everybody. We faced a lot of adversity, but we should be used to that by now. Sounds harmless, right? But here's the thing. That's not the language of a unified team. That's the language of someone carefully choosing words to avoid making things worse. In sports, phrases like "we need everyone" or "we've got to adjust" are usually code for deeper frustration. They're polite ways of saying not everyone is on the same page. They're signals that players are biting their tongues instead of calling things out directly. And Sophie isn't the only one. Multiple veterans have hidden to that frustration with rotations, with how minutes are being distributed, and with the late-game decision-making that keeps costing them wins. Nobody is naming names, but you don't have to. The tension is right there in the gaps between their words. Now layer Caitlin Clark into this picture. Even if she's not on the court, she's still the most influential voice in the organization. Imagine the kind of conversations that would be happening if she were active and watching these late-game collapses firsthand. Do you really think she'd sit quietly while proven players are ignored in crunch time? Or while the same coaching philosophy fails again and again? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Her absence makes managing that tension a lot easier. Without Clark in the mix, veterans can be brushed aside, rotations can be enforced without pushback, and the coaching staff can present a united front. But the second she's back, all of those quiet frustrations are going to have a megaphone. So while the Fever's public face is all about adjustments and staying together, the cracks in the foundation are already visible. And the longer the losses pile up, the harder it becomes to cover them. But if you think that's where the accountability ends, think again. Because what happens at the microphone after these games may be even more revealing than what happens inside the locker room. If there's one thing fans notice as much as the games themselves, it's how leaders handle the spotlight after those games. And when it comes to Stephanie White, one word keeps coming up: deflection. Go back and watch the press conferences after these collapses. The pattern is undeniable. Every time the Fever lose a winnable game, the explanations sound eerily similar. We were slow on defense. We didn't adjust. New players are still learning the system. Notice what's missing? Any admission that coaching decisions, substitutions, late game play calls, crunch time rotations might have played a role. That's not accountability. That's passing the blame. And this isn't just about protecting pride in the moment. When a coach consistently avoids responsibility, it creates ripple effects. Players hear it, fans hear it, the locker room feels it. It's one thing to lose, it's another to lose and watch leadership refuse to own the mistakes everyone else can see. That's how frustration turns into resentment. Now combine that with the timeline we've been tracking. Clark out of the lineup, Sophie minimized in clutch moments, and a coach who doubles down on system first while sidestepping accountability every step of the way. What does that tell you? It tells you that results aren't the top priority right now. Control is. And here's where it gets even more concerning. The WNBA has been cracking down harder this season on players criticizing officials or coaching decisions, hitting them with fines for even mild public comments. Sophie Cunningham herself got slapped with a $500 penalty over social media activity. Since then, notice how quiet she's been online compared to her usual tone. When players feel they can't speak freely without getting punished and the coach refuses to shoulder responsibility, the only narrative left standing is the one management wants to push. And that's how control gets cemented, by silencing dissent on both sides of the microphone. But here's the catch. You can only suppress reality for so long, because eventually the results speak louder than the excuses. And right now, the results are exposing a bigger picture that goes far beyond bad luck or a cold shooting night. Step back for a moment and look at the whole picture. The Indiana Fever aren't just losing games. They're losing them in a way that feels scripted. Collapses that repeat the same mistakes, lineups that ignore proven performers, press conferences that deflect blame instead of owning it. When you connect the dots, the pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like strategy. Because think about what this timeline has really provided. Caitlin Clark's extended absence has created a vacuum, a rare window of time where the most powerful voice in the locker room is sidelined. No superstar pushing back against questionable rotations, no generational talent questioning why the ball keeps slipping out of reliable hands in crunch time. Just silence. And in that silence, a new system is being forced into place. A system where Sophie Cunningham's consistency gets overshadowed. A system where system first takes priority over winning. A system where a coach can test her philosophy without interference, even if it means sacrificing games in the standings.
Meanwhile, the media narratives line up perfectly with this approach. Early talk of the Fever being better without Clark props up the philosophy. When reality contradicts that narrative, the voices disappear, the storyline vanishes, the silence fills the gaps, and suddenly, all anyone hears is the version of the truth that leadership wants to circulate. Put it all together, and what do you see? A coaching staff using a medical timeline as operational cover. A team reshaping its identity not because it's winning, but because it's convenient. And a string of losses that look less like accidents and more like byproducts of a bigger agenda. This is why the Fever struggles feel so frustrating for fans. It's not just that they're losing, it's that the losses look preventable,
like the results are secondary to proving a point. And in a playoff race where every game matters, that kind of approach doesn't just hurt the standings, it risks sabotaging the entire season. So when we talk about the bigger picture, it isn't just about basketball. It's about control. It's about power. It's about how a carefully timed absence can reshape the balance of influence inside a team, and how silence, both in the locker room and in the media, keeps the truth just out of reach. But here's the thing about silence. It never lasts forever. And the moment Caitlin Clark steps back on the floor, the timeline we've been tracking finally collides with reality. And that's when we'll see whether this bigger picture survives contact with its biggest star. So where does this all lead? That's the million-dollar question. Because no matter how carefully this system has been controlled, everything changes the moment Caitlin Clark returns. On one hand, her presence could instantly restore balance. Clark isn't just a scorer, she's a magnet for defenses, a voice that demands the ball in critical moments, and a leader who shifts the energy of the entire arena. If she steps back in and reclaims her role, the Fever could flip their fortunes overnight. The narrative of collapse could suddenly turn into a redemption arc that fuels a playoff push when it matters most. But here's the flip side. Clark's return doesn't just bring back talent, it brings back power. And power disrupts control. If she pushes back against rotations, if she questions late-game decisions, if she insists on maximizing players like Sophie Cunningham instead of burying them, the tension that's been carefully contained could erupt. The cracks in the locker room, the media silence, the accountability gaps, all of it could rush to the surface. And fans are already speculating. Some believe this entire stretch has been about proving a system works without her. Others think it's about protecting her image by letting the team stumble in her absence. And still others wonder if the Fever are quietly bracing for a bigger shakeup, whether in the coaching staff, the front office, or even the roster itself. What we know for sure is this: silence can't last forever. The Fever can't keep losing games without answers, and Clark can't stay sidelined indefinitely. Something has to give. And when it does, we may finally see whether this was just a stretch of bad basketball or evidence of a bigger agenda playing out behind the scenes. Because if the past few weeks have shown us anything, it's this: what happens next in Indiana isn't just about basketball. It's about truth, power, and who really controls the future of this franchise.
So here's where we land. Over the past few weeks, we've traced a pattern that's too sharp to dismiss as coincidence. A 19-point lead evaporating in the blink of an eye. Back-to-back losses to teams the Fever should have handled. A superstar sidelined for 12 straight games with no clear timeline. A reliable scorer in Sophie Cunningham systematically ignored in crunch time. Media narratives that collapsed just as fast as the team's offense. And a coaching philosophy that looks more like a stubborn experiment than a plan to win basketball games. Put all the pieces together and the picture is clear. This isn't just about basketball. This is about control. About who gets to shape the narrative, dictate the system, and decide whose voice really matters inside the Fever organization. Now, whether you believe this timeline is a conspiracy, a coincidence, or just the growing pains of a young franchise, one thing's undeniable. The Fever are wasting opportunities in the middle of a playoff race, and fans deserve answers. That's where you come in, because I don't want this to just be my investigation, I want it to be ours. So drop a comment. Do you think Caitlin Clark's injury timeline is just unfortunate timing, or do you see the same operational convenience that I do? Should Sophie Cunningham be featured more in crunch time, or is this all part of a longer-term plan we can't see yet? And when Clark returns, will she reset the balance or expose the deeper cracks that have been papered over in her absence? If this breakdown opened your eyes, smash that like button so more people can see the connections mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe if you want to keep following the breadcrumbs with me, because trust me, we're not done. There's more to uncover, and the deeper we dig, the more uncomfortable truths we're going to find.